everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Strategic Thinking, Making Yourself Indispensable to Your C-Suite, presented by Jill Johnson and brought to you by IFMA's Corporate Facilities Council. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and you are muted to prevent background noise during the presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the questions box, and if time permits, Jill will answer your questions at the end of the presentation. I now turn you over to the CFC's Programs Committee Chair, Dexter Barrow.
Good
Hello,
afternoon,
did y'all hear?
everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our CFC monthly Wednesday webinar series. What a way to get the month started. Just like to take a moment to recognize the CFC Council for winning the Council of the Year this year, and a big shout out to Jose Diaz for receiving the Emerging Professional of the Year award, which is much deserved. We'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, SenseFix, eStructurer, First On Site, Empire Office, and Tersano, who help us to bring this wonderful content to you month after month. We'd also like to give a big shout out to Linda Besetsky and Wayne Weitzel for being champions of the CFC. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jill J. Johnson, MBA, President and founder of Johnson Consulting Services, a management consulting firm specializing in strategic development. Her strategic guidance has driven more than $4 billion in business impact. She's an award-winning author, a trusted C-suite advisor, a sought-after professional speaker. Jill's a two-time Business Hall of Fame inductee and was named the 2025 Top Management Consultant of the Year by the International Association of Top Professionals. But as you know, we like to share some things that you may not know about our presenter. One moment. The first is that she trains and shows Rottweilers all over the country. And the second is that when she was 3 years old, she won a Shetland pony. And she won that by finding a golden Easter egg at an Easter egg hunt. Without further ado, Jill, would you take it away?
Thank you, Dexter. It's been so great to work with you and Kylie in putting this presentation together. I'm so excited too because we have FMs from all over the world who are participating in our session today, and it speaks volumes to the CFC and the magnitude of the impact that you're having, that you come together for this kind of additional conversation and insight, because all of it will at the end of the day make you better facility management professionals, leaders, and managers. And as I was preparing for this session, I took some time to look at some of the other presentations that you've had since this series began in August. And in looking at your balancing the urgent and strategic FM, you know, that presentation gave you some of the tools like the Eisenhower matrix on how to carve out time for strategic thinking. What we'll be doing in today's session is teaching you what to do with that strategic time, how to look at your insights, how to think them through, and so that you can present them in a way that your leadership will understand and value. The second thing, the second webinar was on articulating the value of smart buildings. And that gave a lot of technical and operational benefits of all these new and emerging technologies like AI, the Internet of Things, fault detection, data, and so forth. What we'll do today in this webinar is provide you with some of the communications insights so that you can translate those benefits more effectively to leaders in that C-suite who really don't understand necessarily these things as well as you do. And then the third component, the third webinar was on selling the future workplace, that future casting, if you will. And that was really about, you know, the forward thinking and having that high high-level vision for workplace, but it also will, in this webinar, help you get some better insights on how you can be a champion for that vision internally and help you to better align those insights with the long-term strategic vision that your C-suite executives have for the enterprise, because it's about what is important to them as we go through. So when we think about the C-suite, when I first started doing this content, I actually developed it for speaking at a state IFMA conference. And one of the audience members, I was talking about C-suite at the very beginning, and one of the audience members yelled out, "So who is the C-suite?" And I realized that not everyone knows what that reference is. So I want to take just a minute and pull that curtain back to give you some perspective. The C-suite are all those high-level folks in your organization. It's the CEO, it's the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, it's the Chief Financial Officer, the Chief Operating Officer. It might be your General Counsel, a division president if you're a very large company. And below that is a level that we call close to the C-suite. And so you need to understand where your role links with these people and decision makers, and so that you can better understand the issues that they're addressing and where FM connects to it, so that you can provide them with the insights and the information that they need to do their jobs better and to make better decisions. The other thing is I need to, in order to make today's session really valuable, is to know who's on the call here. And so I want you to do a little quick self-assessment. We're going to have a poll in a minute to help me understand what your knowledge level is. If you're a 1, if you have a basic level of understanding, I kind of know a little bit, but I'm here today because I want to get some greater insight. You're a 2 if you're getting comfortable with it, you've been in your position for a while, and you're starting to understand where FM fits in. And then you're a 3 if you are a master of strategy. You know this stuff inside and out, and you are all hooked up on understanding where everything is. So take a quick minute, and where people are starting to chime in. I love, because I get to see as you're kind of rolling back and forth where you are. But we clearly have some more experienced people on the call. A variety of you are getting comfortable. We've got 73% of you have taken the time to vote. So let's get a few more, and then we'll move it on. We've got a little bit more going. I want to hit at least 80%, and then we'll go, everybody's coming through. Well, now you're going to make me want to get to 90. So we've got 85% voting. And Kylie, we're going to go ahead and just lock it off there. Some people might not be in a position where they're going to be able to do that. So why don't we go back and share it again? And then why don't you give me the survey results, Kylie?
Yes, so we had about 67% say that they were, well, let's share again. Sorry, 55% say they were getting comfortable. That was the most popular. Next was Master of Strategy, 32%, and then 14% of us are at a 1, a basic understanding.
Perfect. Well, what I'm going to do is to try and talk to all 3 levels here, because for those of you who are at that basic level of understanding, I'm not going to get all jargony on you, because I want you to understand as much as you can about the principles and the issues, so that you'll be more valuable. And for those of you that are at a higher level of expertise, this will deepen your insight so that you can take your knowledge to the next level. The one thing I want you to understand, though, about strategy and what's happening in the C-suite level is there's this concept called VUCA. And I don't care if you remember the word, but it's what it represents. And it's the world that we're operating in the business environment now is volatile, it is uncertain, It is complex and ambiguous. Again, that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. When I started strategy work a few decades ago, the business world was much more stable. You could make a decision and you could run with your strategic plan for, 3 to 5 years, sometimes even longer, and you pretty well knew that how things were going to roll out. But in today's business climate, everything is so off kilter that it's really hard to know if you're making the right decisions. And that's where, as you look at the issues that touch FM, it is so vital for you to recognize that the world in which your executive suite is operating and the board members that they report to, they're trying to juggle all kinds of different competing issues and challenges to make the right decision to keep the organization moving forward. What it also means is that you're going to need to advance your own skill set. And there are a variety of different organizations that do assessments with CEOs on what kind of skills they think the workforce is really in need of. And I like this summary because I've been tracking this one for about 15 years. And it's number one is analytical thinking and innovation. They need you to think about the future and where facility management falls in so that they can budget more appropriately, they can think more appropriately about what they're doing, and you're in a perfect spot to begin to help seed that information. The second component is they need active learning. They need you to be continuing to take your time to do exactly what you're doing today. Being on a webinar to hear some new thoughts, to stretch your thinking, that active learning is going to be what you bring to the table to help them be more effective, and you're going to be a better participant in supporting their role. The third is complex problem solving. I think it's fair to say, I worked with I had a client that was a security company, and it had evolved from a locksmith company. So, they were changing locks on doors and cutting keys and things like that. But the world that they're involved with is completely different. And so that complex problem solving that they've had to deal with as they've shifted to a computer aided locking technology, more sophisticated algorithms, and things of that nature has required different skills from their team. It's required transitions and how they've moved through that, plus the investment. So your skills in complex problem solving will be hugely important as well. They also need your critical thinking and your ability to analyze. One of the things that I hear a lot of people in the C-suite complain about right now is that schools aren't teaching critical thinking. And what that really means is that you're trying to look at all the different variables that are at play, not just looking at situations from, oh, it's going to be great, well, and good, it's all going to be perfect, we make this one little tweak and we're fine. Critical thinking and analysis means that you are always ongoing in trying to understand the critical things that are going to affect the organization. They are relying on you to be the leading edge and the front edge of understanding what's going to be happening and what they need to look at. And then the whole concept of being creative, original, and taking initiative. And that means, again, stepping forward. So I want you to think about, as we continue to go through our session today, which skill do you need to focus on? Are you going to be someone that's going to be doing active learning? That's for those of you that are in that, that were rated as a number one, you're actively learning right now, and that's your best platform. For those of you that are masters of strategy, you're going to be more involved in complex problem solving, the analytical thinking, the critical thinking, and the innovation. And for those of you in the middle, it'll be somewhere in between. So what are some of the keys to strategic thinking? We really look at three different things. One is using strategic information. And a lot of times people get a little overwhelmed because they don't feel like they're good with numbers and data. That's okay. the information is there for you to be able to work with, and you will build your skill set by just stepping in and diving in and using it. Now, I want to caution you. Some people say, oh, I should just use AI to analyze my data. You know, you have to remember that there's proprietary data that you're sharing, and if you're using AI, once you load it up, it's not necessarily private any longer. So you have to be very mindful of what you do and how you use it. But you can work with your teams. You can work with some of your own internal information and being able to look at that. The second, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail on each of these, the second is you need to become a business asset. All too often in the corporate world, the C-suite looks at FM as a cost center. You know, it's just something that they have to pay for. Well, but you can become a business asset when you start to think about how FM touches all of the different avenues, everything from the productivity of the workforce to the safety and security of the team, and so forth. So you have to be the business asset that they look to help pull that together. And then finally, and the most important one, and this is where a lot of people fail, and for those of you that are masters of the strategy world, your communication skills and how you're able to leverage this information and business insight to the C-suite is the most critical thing that you'll need to be able to work on. So let's talk through a little bit more about strategic information. As I said, back in the olden days when I started in strategy, you know, we could sit around the campfire and, you know, sing Kumbaya and do some vision questing and be able to make decisions that we could rely on for a long period of time. Some of you have been in strategy sessions where, you know, you do the post-it note on the wall, you know, what's our big vision? What's our big goal? And I'm really not that kind of strategy person. I use data and information and insight about the organization to make those suggestions and decisions. And one of the things that you need to think about is what is the enterprise life cycle and where is your organization in that framework of their organizational maturity. And a lot of us, you know, are working in larger corporations, but some of you are not. Some of you are in entrepreneurial organizations where maybe there was a founder who started it up and you've been kind of working your way through. Some of you are in that high rapid growth phase where, you know, everything is different. You're onboarding lots of new people. You're trying to figure out where they're going to sit, how they're going to have their space laid out. Some of you are in those very large enterprises that feel like they're stable because all the processes and procedures are well in place. But there's always a cycle that everyone goes through, and that's where they either get into a place where they're either declining and probably going to fail, or they have to renew and think about things new and differently. And each of those spaces where you move from one part of the life cycle to the next are what we in strategy call inflection points. And when you're at an inflection point is the riskiest time for the organization. So part of your strategic thinking is, where is our organization in their life cycle? Is this a growth organization? Is it a mature organization, or somewhere on either end of the spectrum? And a lot of times people don't think about those kinds of things because it impacts how the C-suite looks at where they're going to prioritize their money and resources. So you have to understand that so you'll be better positioned to think about where this will go through. There's also a couple other things, and I'm going to go through this slide really quickly. When you're looking at building an enterprise that endures, so that's maybe in that maturity stage and moves on, there are 8 key cycle points. They need to have a vision. Where are they headed? They need to engage in strategic planning. They need to have workforce that have the skills they need to meet their customer needs. They have to have the financial wherewithal to be able to weather the challenges that they might be facing. They have to learn to adapt, and that for a lot of organizations is right now where the real pain point is, because they're having to adapt to too many things all at once, and so it becomes very difficult to prioritize. There are also organizations that have substance to them. They're not smoke and mirrors. They're not, BS and fluffy and whatever. The businesses and enterprises that stand the test of time, and I work with many organizations that are 40, 60, 70, 100 years old. They have adapted over time, and they have something real that they're offering and selling to their customers. They manage their growth carefully, and they sustain the motivation of their key leadership in their team. And so when you think about your organization, where do you fit? And here's the critical thing. To have an enduring enterprise, you need all 8. So if there's issues with internal motivation or issues with money, then that's the kind of thing where an organization is going to potentially struggle. And it's your job to link FM and the resources that you're responsible for to the corporate goals. Everything you need to think about, especially when you're dealing with C-suite, is how does what we do affect them and their ability to achieve the goals that they have set for our enterprise. And your role could have a whole lot of different elements to it, but you need to get really clear on what it is that you do and how does it link to corporate strategy. Now, there are a variety of market forces that are at play right now that are impacting the corporate world. And we'll go through these kind of quickly, but I want you to start to think about how do these affect you in FM? So for example, the demographics of the workforce are shifting pretty significantly. We're moving out of what in ties in with the generations. The baby boomers are now leaving, and you've got younger generations, the whole work from home concept. Well, that's creating all sorts of challenges and angst within the corporate community as they're trying to identify ways to link that younger workforce to the more mature workforce. And so when you look at FM, you have to understand that there are just differences in how the generations will impact and what they do. The economy is another huge factor for us. And here, I'm going to step back again. The 9 components that we look at, I like to break down into 3 smaller segments because it's a little easier to get your hands around. So the first are the things with people. So we have different ethnicities, we have different age cohorts, we have different income levels, we have different skill sets, different education. All of those fall into the demographic component. The generation component I mentioned is another factor that impacts and influences what's happening with the workforce. But it's this generational one that is a really difficult thing for most of us to get our hands around, because the older generations, we have a pretty good idea. And here's the thing, if you're dealing with a C-suite that is a baby boomer, they often like things in a written format. The longer, the better. But when you're dealing with Gen X and millennials, as they move into the C-suite, their expectations for communication are often very different. They prefer things in quick snippets, in short takes, short bites. Think about reels on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, that short, quick hit. So if everything that you're doing is so detailed and so cumbersome, you may not be able to communicate effectively. And the workforce is different. A lot of us didn't have technology like this when we came in. So understanding those shifts and changes, particularly as you're looking at building security and the infrastructure that's required to keep that workforce safe. 40 years ago, we didn't have the same issues with active shooter or those kinds of things. And so it's your job in FM to be able to think those things through. I'm on webinars every week or every other week that are looking at all sorts of issues of security. Sometimes it's cybersecurity. And so having the physical infrastructure and the electrical infrastructure that you're able to handle the complexities of the technologies that are being required in the workforce now are very, very different from what they used to be. So your job is to pay attention to that and leverage it. The other thing is there's this thing called psychographics, and I don't care if you remember the word as much as I care that you remember what it is. It's those things that are internal to your customer group. And so for you, your customer, when you're dealing with the C-suite, is concerned about profitability. They're concerned about how they're going to make the proper investments based on the business objectives that they have, and how are they going to balance all of those competing objectives. And their ability to not have anxiety over that is part of the psychological profile of who you're dealing with. And so it's very important to understand, are they liberal, are they conservative, are they risk takers, are they risk averse? Thinking through the parallel perspectives of the psychology of those that you deal with will be an important factor for you as well. The financial is the second component of our market forces. And it's things like the economy. I mean, are we in a recession or recovery? Some days you're in both. And so understanding how the economy is impacting your business enterprise, even in FM, will give you a better idea of, hey, this might be a good time for me to put forward some ideas for future investments, or recognizing I can tee those investment ideas up, but given the way the economy is, it's very unlikely that they're going to make the investment now. So understand that is a really important thing. And let's be honest, you're considered an operating cost for most of the organizations that you're involved with. So understanding when you've got ideas for cost savings and how you're able to quantify that is truly valuable. The capital markets are impacting FM all the time, because what happens with the ability to get money and invest money in building new infrastructure, in renovating older buildings. This is an area I've spent quite a bit of my professional career in, and in the decisions that I've influenced. The ability of the capital of clients to be able to get the money they need to make those investments in their physical plant and their infrastructures has a huge effect. It may be $1 million that they need to set aside because they needed to retool their heavy concrete high-rise building so that it can handle Wi-Fi, which, you know, again, didn't exist at the time that the building was built. Or are they going to have to tear a building down and completely renovate, or are they going to have to sell and buy something new? Understanding that that's going to have an effect on where the organization goes. And then we have what we call the disruptors. And the disruptors are the biggest challenge for us because you can't get any handle around them except to know that there's always going to be a disruptor influencing decisions. The biggest disruptor is what we call the black swan event. And if you think about COVID, COVID was the ultimate black swan. I don't think anyone really thought that we would be shifting to this whole remote work environment. It wasn't on the radar, but it's having significant impact. Even, let's say, in the healthcare arena, for example, you know, because they can now do telemedicine, they don't need all of the physical clinics and the infrastructure that they needed before. The same thing is holding true in the financial services industry. For example, banks, lots and lots of banks are closing down locations because they simply don't need it, because their customers have gotten more comfortable with using technology and using apps and other resources. So they're doing things now by virtue of this remote technology. There are lots of other things that those black swan events have done, but here's the thing, there will always be another. There will be another recession. There will be another unanticipated issue. September 11th, 2001 was another perfect one, perfect example of one. The financial crash in 2008-9, that was another black swan that people didn't anticipate, that where almost the entire market fell apart. There will always be something. So your job in FM is to worst case scenario. One of the reasons I'm on a variety of these really complex webinars that I watch weekly and every other week is because I'm trying to understand what the risks are to the organizations that I serve. And sometimes it goes a pretty far afield, but you have to do that when you're thinking ahead. Government interaction, the whole thing with government shutdown right now is having a huge effect on a variety of organizations. It has everything on the impact from taxes to employment to whether or not you can even be open. So understanding the role government plays within the FM world is important too. Science and technology, I mean, it's changing everything. With science, our people are living longer, they're working in ways that we couldn't have anticipated. And with technology, we're now working in that whole remote world. But we're going to be seeing more and more automation. So your ability to understand the impacts of automation and the impacts of robotics is a whole nother field of study. Not that you need to know the nuances of, but you have to be thinking about and wondering, what might this do to our world and our responsibilities? Paying attention to competition. A lot of times the shifts and changes occur because competitors are coming into the market. The reason in the FM world that I'm involved with, my clients, their real estate is customer facing, and so they're having to be physically appealing to the market that they serve. And when new competitors come into play, that changes the expectations and the perceptions. And so understanding and having Google alerts and doing competitor intel just helps you to pay attention to see what newfangled things they're doing and whether or not you're going to have to adjust to be competitive. And then just industry changes. It's changing all the time. And that's where taking advantage of webinars like this, especially for the FM world, puts you at the leading edge of your peers in the industry, because you are intentionally trying to think about what else you need to look at so that you can stay on top of your game. So again, those market forces are complex, and I want you to just think about and make notes today too about which market force impacts your enterprise and why is that, so that you can begin to look for resources to help you pay attention and be exposed to the things that might make your critical thinking and your strategic thinking more impactful, because you're paying attention and you're looking ahead. The second part is becoming a business asset. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by a business asset is that you need to be going from a cost to someone who provides value. And in thinking about that whole thing, you want to look at the insight that you can provide to your C-suite. You want to be tracking metrics that may be useful or appropriate and for them as they're looking at the goals and the objectives that they're responsible for. It's your responsibility to think about, how can we optimize assets? If money is tight, then you rethinking how we can put more people or more resources in the available space you have is really powerful. I gave this challenge to our facility manager for a client that I was working with. I worked with Mayo Clinic for almost a decade in doing some strategy work with one of their divisions. And we had a physical plant that we really couldn't add to. So we had to think about, how could we optimize what we had in a really powerful way. And I gave him a lot of challenges and perspectives about the kinds of resources that we needed to include. And it took several months, but he came back to me one day and he said, Jill, I think I have it figured out. If we move the administrative offices to a different part of the building, that opens up prime real estate that is customer facing, and we can renovate and create a resource and a service that's a valuable service that will be valuable to the people that we serve, and won't cost as much as if we were trying to do it elsewhere. And the more we went through it, he was absolutely spot on, but he had to be challenged to think about how to optimize that asset. So I'm going to challenge you right now in the role that you have. How can you optimize? I had another client in Seattle that I was working with that was complaining about they didn't have space for activities and programming and whatnot. And I took a tour of the building and I realized the whole lower level of their building was just storage. And honestly, it was storage with crap. It's stuff that shouldn't have been in the building. And they needed about 5 dumpsters to just get rid of things like old suitcases and light fixtures and things that weren't relevant any longer. And that then with minimal cost could have been renovated to being usable space. So thinking about your assets that you're responsible for, what can you do? How can you create new possibilities with what you have? And the most important part is the things that you do have to link strategically to the issues and the challenges that those C-suite executives are dealing with. And if you leave with nothing else from today, that's the key message I want as a takeaway. Now, what I want to also keep you focused on is that I don't want you just giving them information. You need to start to distill that information into insights that they need to think about relative to their responsibilities, relative to the people that they're responsible for. And all too often, as people are moving from that novice level to the more experienced level of being an FM manager and executive, they often don't understand that they're just giving information. They're just giving data. They're just giving a chart. They're just giving a table of numbers. The key is for you to help interpret that. Executives are running at such a rapid and fast pace right now, they don't have a lot of time to be able to sit down and distill. So your job is to help give them that insight quickly so that you become that value added resource to them. And you can think about the different metrics that they're dealing with. And you do not need to be a financial rock star. But FM, for the most part, has a lot of involvement in human resources and in the finance world. So you can ask AI, you can maybe describe your company and say, this is what we do, high level, don't give away any corporate secrets, but you can say, I'm responsible for facilities management for X, Y, and for these types of services and resources. What are some metrics that I could begin to look at? Or better yet, I want some of you that are on this call today to connect with others in the Corporate Facilities Council to brainstorm about what metrics you could be focusing on. It's when we get out of our own heads that we're much more effective and impactful and powerful. And the best way that you can do that is by talking to each other. And you can use these resources as a way to figure out exactly what to do. You don't need to read the whole financial statement for your company, but you need to know the areas that you touch so that you can look at what metrics might matter within that. And then the whole idea of optimizing assets, I've given you a couple examples of that today, but I want you to think about the assets that are under your control or that you influence. Where are there opportunities that you could begin to think about? Now, you don't ever go in with a half-cocked idea and say, oh, we need to do this. Now is the time for you to begin to think about it, to begin to give consideration to what kinds of financial impact there might be, what kind of financial resources might be required for you to be able to pull this all together. And doing it now when the stakes are low will give you, when all of a sudden there's some kind of a crisis, you'll have already got some ideas and answers, and you will be way ahead of the game. And again, more valuable to the people that you're dealing with. But thinking about where you can optimize it. But the key thing about everything that you do when you're dealing with your C-suite leadership is you absolutely must link everything that you're doing and talking about to their priorities. And if it's not a priority for them, then you need to help them understand why it needs to be. And typically the 4 key areas that a C-suite executive is focused on is the areas of where we make money. They have their biggest concerns like human resources. How are we going to keep our people connected to our enterprise? If they're coming in, then we need to have a physical environment that is conducive to productivity and optimal work. And if we're working remotely, then how does that infrastructure link us in a safe and secure way? What are their pain points? What keeps them up at night? That is a powerful, powerful thing. If you can understand the most critical issues that are impacting the leaders in your company and your organization, you're going to start to see where FM touches those pain points and has the ability to be a pain reliever and to offset some of the stress that they're feeling. And the more that you can do that, the more valuable you'll become. And as I've said repeatedly throughout the webinar here today, connecting FM to the strategic goals of the enterprise is the most powerful thing that you can do. Now, a lot of times people say, well, Jill, how do we figure out what our strategic priorities are? Well, that's where that active listening comes into play. That's where, when you're around those C-suite executives, even if it's just if you're standing behind them in the elevator, listening to the issues and the things that they talk about, write down the words that they're saying, write down the issues that they've raised. It may not make sense to you in that moment, but if you can circle back on it and reflect on it, maybe do a little bit of research, you'll start to better understand. The other thing, if you're a publicly traded company or a company that gets a lot of local press or media attention, put Google alerts out for your company name so that you get emails with links to articles on your company or your key executives, because if they're talking to the public, they're giving and leaking information about what those priorities are. And just a couple quick insights on how you can communicate more effectively with your C-suite. And this is the area where a lot of folks in FM frankly struggle with, because you're good at the things that are in your purview, but it gets a little intimidating sometimes when you have to talk to those C-suite executives that have that perceived power, if you will. And so I'm going to give you some insights, pull that curtain back just a little bit so that maybe you can get a little bit more comfortable with it. First of all, you have to speak in the language of the C-suite. And what I said earlier is about using your active listening skills. They're giving clues all the time about the issues that they're dealing with. And then you have to identify what are the issues and the words that fall into that. So for example, I was at an event and I was listening to a couple of women talk, and one of the women was very upset. She had she was pretty high up in her organization, but she had to speak to the highest levels of her company, and they were very dismissive. And one of the gentlemen in the room turned to the other and said, "I don't know what she's talking about." And she immediately took it to be, oh, they're not listening to me because I'm a woman. But the more she explained the things that they were saying, I said, no, that's not the issue at all. So the issue is you didn't speak in their language. Because when that gentleman turned to the other guy and said, I don't know what she's talking about, the other one said, oh, she's talking about ROI, which for those of you is return on investment. And she had the right information, but she wasn't framing it in the C-suite language that their people needed to hear it in. So they weren't hearing it at all. But as soon as the one gentleman framed it as ROI, all of a sudden it now made sense. So understanding those key words they're using is really important. I've mentioned about active listening, and you have an opportunity to use that active listening skill set to help you move forward. But you also need to be concise, and that's where your thinking issues and avenues through is so vital and important as you come together with the C-suite, because you know all of the detail. And I personally, I struggle with being concise, and I have to work really hard to give them the high level conclusions. But I also have the background information, because if they want it, I know that I can provide that to them or provide them a deeper dive. And this is a hard one, but you need to have big font and very clear charts and graphs. So if you're creating and sharing information for that insight, use the entire slide. Use the whole bit of paper. You want the font as big as it can be, and you want the point that you want to make as quickly and easily readable as possible. Because here's the truth. People in the C-suite are all pretty much over the age of 45. We can't see it when you have it in tiny font. And I cannot tell you how many reports I see where the font is so small that you simply can't read it. And so if you do that for your C-suite, you'll be very, very far apart ahead of the game. And be confident. And that means practicing. So if you have a presentation to do with your C-suite, practice it. And you also want to practice it in such a way that maybe you're going to expect that somebody's going to interrupt you. So practice with a little bit of a stress so that you don't get off your game in the middle of the moment. So as we're coming to the end, I want you to think about how you can make your communication more effective with the C-suite. What piece of this can you own? And before we get to final thoughts, we're going to go ahead and open it up. If there are any questions that have come through, this is the time for us to do it. Or you can write your question and put it in the chat. Do we have any questions?
We did get one question more about housekeeping. We were asked if we're going to share your slides, Jill. And I want everybody to know that you will get the recording of this tomorrow afternoon in your email. You'll have Jill's whole recording and you'll be able to see her slides again. And that recording link you can also share with others. So like Jill was encouraging us to share with other CFC members or coworkers and think about these ideas, you'll be able to share this recording with those people. So yes, you will get the recording and the slides. And
I
then,
think, go ahead, Kylie.
oh yes, Jill, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say, honestly, you all have seen my slides don't have a lot of text and content on the slide. What I would suggest, Kylie, is if you could also share with them the link to the article I wrote on strategic thinking for your magazine. I think that will be more impactful than sharing the slide deck in and of itself, because there's a lot of insight that's already in that, and a little bit more text, if you will, than the slide deck itself.
And that's a good plug. Thank you, Jill, for our FM Professional magazine. All of our CFC members get that sent to their email. It's our quarterly magazine. So if you haven't read one, Jill's article will be a great place to start.
Good. Dexter, did any other questions come through for you?
No questions came through for me. Jill, I wanted to just say that this was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I want to thank you for taking your time and sharing your experience with us. I always say to folks, sometimes if you have questions that come up later, right?
Yeah.
Jill, is it okay for folks to reach out to you and just, start a relationship directly with you?
Absolutely. I've got a couple other slides, so let me go through those and then we can wrap up, and that will give them some contact info so that they can see. Again, I just wanted to remind you that there are 3 keys to your strategic thinking. It's how you use strategic information, it's how you think about becoming a business asset, and how you communicate effectively with the C-suite. And that is not me, but I am predicting that in my crystal ball, that if you do any of what we talked about today, you will be a much more impactful FM than you were before you started. And if you continue to come to these Wednesday webinars, it may feel for a while, especially for those of you that are new, like, wow, there's so much going on. This is way too much. I'm not understanding it. Go back over the sessions again. Listen to them in your car. You can listen to them on 2x or 1.5 times faster so that you can hear them over and over again. You have so much content that if you make the investment in yourself, you are going to be a much more successful FM, and you're going to end up creating that bigger value. Because here's the truth, there are opportunities for you to build your skill set everywhere. There are opportunities for you to think more strategically. Even if you're not ready to share it with your C-suite, you can share your ideas with your peers. And honestly, if you haven't got an accountability buddy within your Corporate Facilities Council membership, find one, because you need to be able to talk through, okay, when she was talking about that thing about whatever, so that you can share those ideas back and forth, and you can deepen your insight and your knowledge to be much more, to make the learning more robust and real. And I want you to take ownership of what your next steps will be on how you're going to build your strategic thinking, your strategic insights, so that you can be more valuable. If you just take one next step, you're going to be further along. But especially if you do it with intention. All too often people kind of flop around and they're like, yeah, well, maybe I'll get to it or whatever. But the more intentional you can be, the better it will be. And then you'll be in an opportunity to just pick like 2 or 3 things that will be your strategic focus area that you're going to learn on. You don't need to learn 800 things. You learn them as you go, as you build your career, one step at a time. And my contact info, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a variety of folk from IFMA that I'm connected to. My email is jill@jcs-usa.com. Again, that's jill@jcs-usa.com. You can look at my website. I've got a couple white papers there that you might find useful, and that's jcs-usa.com is the website. And on social media, I'm Jill Johnson USA, because there's a Jill Johnson from Sweden that is everywhere, and I will never get past her. So I'm the Jill Johnson USA. But it's been my honor. IFMA has been a powerful organization that I've had the great privilege of being connected with off and on now for well over the last 10 to 15 years. And I've watched and mentored and navigated with some amazing FMs as they started in their early career, where their strategic thinking, apparently one of them, he showed me his first strategic plan, and he was all excited about it. And I don't have any memory of saying this, but it feels very real. And I said, oh, honey, that's not a strategic plan. That's a to-do list. So you will learn, and he's now at the apex of his career, because he spent that time being very intentional about moving from the to-do list to that deeper insight and the relevance and all of the things that we've talked about today. And your Wednesday webinars are a perfect resource for you to build that strategic skill set, to build that strategic thinking, and to take advantage of your membership in IFMA in a way that other organizations don't always do. And I have been so gratified by the people that I've been connecting with in IFMA. You have an extraordinary leadership team, terrific staff, and members who are absolutely superb and stellar, who want nothing more than for you all to be successful. And I think that sense of community is the most powerful thing that you have within IFMA, that will stretch all of your strategic thinking in ways that even I probably can't envision today. So with that, any final thoughts, Dexter and Kylie?
Joe, one of the things I was thinking about, and was that, the importance of having a mentor, as you grow in this discipline. Would you talk a little bit to that? I know we just have a few minutes, but maybe you can share that, because it's something that people in my chapter have asked, younger members have asked about, and that, it's something that, us older practitioners could help out with.
Absolutely. Kylie, maybe we'll bring me back on and I have a whole session on mentoring that can get into the deeper dive on it. But, there's the traditional type of mentoring, which is what we call that coach mentor. It's somebody who invests their time in you either because they like you or they're paid. And there are paid coaches that you can work with to help walk you through and navigate. But there are a variety of other kinds of mentors that I'm a firm believer I can learn from anyone. And I've never had a single mentor. I've had many mentors. Some are mentors that just kind of came into my life for a lunch meeting and said something that just resonated so deep in me that it changed everything. And I've had mentors that I've watched that were really more role models. They weren't people that I really interacted with, but I watched how they handled the situation. In fact, I've got a young guy at the hardcore gym I work out at, and he's 24 maybe, and he had a trip to Montana. I'm like, okay, that's big that they let you do customer facing thing. And I said, so what did you learn while you were there? And he said, I was watching the old guys on our team there, and it was amazing. They didn't get rattled by anything. And so we really debriefed about that. And so sometimes your mentor is that casual and passing, someone that will debrief on you. And he imprinted so significantly what he learned from that there was a day he came up to me at the gym and he's like, I'm so glad you made me go through that exercise because I just was on a client site and everything blew up. And he said, all I could hear was the words in your head. What would the Montana guys do? What would the Montana guys do? And so there's lots of different ways, but make it small. If you can start by asking a question and really actively listening for the answer. But I think a lot of times mentoring has been built up into this thing that is so big and so time consuming and so overwhelming that with the stress levels that most people have right now with trying to balance work and family, they're just not in a position where they can invest that much in your career and your success. But if you break it down, just like I said earlier, into small little bites, you can get the equivalent of that, but just in smaller segments. And as they see you listening to them, as they see you responding, as they see you coming back with having used their idea, they're going to be more likely to invest a bit more in you. And I do that a lot. I give little tests to young people that, Jill, can I pick your brain? Don't use that phrase. People hate to have their brain picked. Just say, Jill, I have a question for you. I'm more likely to meet with you and have coffee if you want to ask me a question than if you want to pick my brain. At best, you'll get a phone or a Zoom call. But what you do is you have something very specific. You don't come in and go, tell me how I should build my career. That's too big. That they don't have enough context for you to give you any answer that's that big. But if you can break it down and say, I'm dealing with an issue right now. Maybe it's a leadership issue, or it's a challenge with a peer, or it's I'm not sure how to look at this information more effectively. Maybe you're going to talk to somebody in your finance department, let's say. Well, if you can have that very specific question, they're mentoring you in that moment. And so count it all as mentoring. Probably the best mentoring I ever did was a young lady who was at the Payless shoe store who was showing me the shoes that she wanted to buy and for a job interview. And I said, well, what are are you going to be a dancer? They were horrible. They had mirror balls on the bottom of them and they were not appropriate footwear for a work environment. And she was interviewing for a job as a nurse. And what she needed was somebody to tell her the truth. And I did. And then we spent a few minutes talking about making eye contact during the interview and how she could, walk in with confidence and, chest up, making eye contact. We worked on her handshake. This is like a 10-minute, 15-minute interaction. And she got the job. I gave her my email so I could hear, and she got the job. So, and I've never heard from her again, but I don't need to because I was able to have that moment with her where I was able to offload. You have people all the time. You just have to pay attention to what they're doing and what they're trying to share with you. And then you can take it that step further and ask that follow-up question.
Thank you so much, Jill. So this is going to lead to another connection with us as we talk about mentoring next year. So
Oh, I can't wait. I'm all in for that one. I'm an
um,
award-winning mentor too. I'm all in.
yeah, I think that fits well with the theme of what we're trying to accomplish here. I want to once again take the time to thank you for taking the time to spend with us today. Right, really, really wonderful information. I want to thank everyone that joined the webinar today. We look forward to seeing you next month at our next webinar. And so, Kylie, I know you want to share a few things about what's coming up.
Really quickly, I want to let you all know that Dexter and I are busy building our 2026 Wednesday webinar schedule. So after you get your post survey from this webinar tomorrow, I want you to look for a link to a survey in there. And if you'll fill out that survey for Dexter and I, you can let us know what type of content that you want to see next year for 2026. And even if you have a speaker in mind, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please fill out that survey when you get your post webinar email tomorrow. I also want to share that we have a webinar coming up next week, a special webinar that is an IFMA benefit of the month hosted by the Corporate Facilities Council, and it is going to be given by Larry Morgan. And some of you may know him. He's been a longtime IFMA member. I just dropped the registration link to that webinar. Again, that is next week, a week from today at the same time, and I hope to see you there. Dexter, that's all I have.
All right, thank you so much. I'd be remiss if I didn't say we would love everyone who's not a member of the Corporate Facility Council to think about joining the Corporate Facility Council. All of these webinars, we have a digital library where you'd be able to get a lot of this information, listen to it over again. I can tell you, I'll be listening to this one from Jill as soon as it's up. So that's one of the benefits of being a member of the council. So thank you very much for joining today, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, Jill.
Bye.